Is it possible to do well by doing good? Yes! The team at Earthwork Collective shows you how people worldwide are doing exactly this. On the Unhurried Conversations with Earthwork Collective podcast, we showcase individuals, teams, and organizations who are making the world a better place by shutting the door on business as usual and heading down the exciting path towards a regenerative economy. So grab a cup of your favorite something, get cozy, and settle in for an unhurried conversation.
We are so thrilled to have kHyal join us today for this unhurried conversation with Earthwork Collective. She has the most impressive resume many of us have ever seen. Passionate educator, kHyal's knowledge, talents, and skills in technology, cybersecurity, digital content and strategy, software as a service, agriculture and climate, and the technology now used in both fields, then writing, arts and culture, design, marketing, fashion, education, and sustainability. Yes, you heard that right. All of them have helped her lead to where she is now, which is a preeminent position as an award-winning artist, communicator, and thought leader. Founder of FiZz Agency and MegaGlam, we'll talk more about that later. She has been featured in countless publications and TV shows for her work, most recently regarding her leading passion, which is the fight against mounting plastic waste. She helps audiences and groups understand and comprehend the urgency of this cause by not just talking and presenting to them. She wears the evidence against it in garments that she designs out of discarded plastic toys and other materials. We first got to know kHyal as our friend and colleague from the Carbon Almanac, where she worked diligently to assist with marketing and created and compiled the book's resources on the fashion industry and sustainable fashion. She also joined the two of us here on this call today to contribute short video clips for the 34 Things to Know About Carbon and Climate LinkedIn learning course hosted by Seth Godin. kHyal's a tireless advocate for the book, for the movement, and environmental awareness and regeneration, and especially the health and wellness of endangered creatures of all kinds, from horseshoe crabs to humans, who really need our consciousness, protection, and love. She's busy all the time, and we're so pleased we could capture this lightning in a bottle, the chief imaginator who brings climate awareness to life through her art, for a short visit with us at Earthwork Collective. Welcome, kHyal.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure I can live up to all you just said.
Well, we'll talk about it. In fact, let me start. Let's kick off our conversation on this unhurried conversation by having you share with us how on earth you got to do what you've done, so much important work, all throughout your life, it sounds like, and what have you been up to lately?
Yeah, I think I'm just always drawn to using my energy in a lot of ways that have nothing to do with earning a living or anything else about the, sort of categorized world as we know it. I've always loved animals, and I was brought up to respect nature by, primarily my dad was that way. And I've worked in technology for a long time, which I've always enjoyed as well. But now I really can't think about anything without thinking first about how it affects our environment in the world, right? And I think the Carbon Almanac project with our great group of people from around the world catalyzed that further, because I've always done the work that I do, but it was often in a silo. I would do it because I had to do it, and it really doesn't scale, as you both know, that way. It doesn't, it has very little impact at where we are with the seriousness of climate change at the moment.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate that. We have talked a lot. In fact, we have a course that is based on the regenerative enterprise and several other principles that are all about regenerative business. And one of the biggest ones is, got to get out of those silos, got to get people talking to each other, you got to get people connecting. With everything you've done and that you're doing right now, and I know you're busy just about every day. You and I were at Yale with their sustainability students and team, a while back. I know that was just one in many of such presentations and get-togethers you do. But with all of that, what's the very best ways you've seen to engage people when you're talking about making a better world, creating it together? What's most impactful to them and to you about those interactions? Or can you think of some?
Oh, yeah. For me personally, it's really, I used to do my art using recycled materials and plastics, and I just did it for myself, right? That art was about processing life as creative people do. And it was critical to my well-being, but now, trying to pass that knowledge along, I find it's not that easy. So, first of all, when I go from my, left brain side, I get too technical, and I can see people glaze over with a list of, like a laundry list of what's wrong, and how we might fix it. It's just too much for the average person that's not in it deeply like we are. So I've been trying to use my art to find ways that are fun, right? They're fun, they're approachable, and they build curiosity so people will ask questions. And that started with a collaboration I did with my husband where I asked him to photograph a lot of things. He and I had collected plastics from the beach. And I did that on purpose so we could, just to keep us on our creative toes. I was here in my home office and he was at the studio, and I said, I left a bucket of items. Could you arrange and photograph it? Because he's a really great photographer. And send me the files. And then I made this apparel. This was a couple years ago that ended up so popular that, hundreds of people have photographed me in it, and people stop me all the time. And it's basically just all plastics found from the beach, but it's so colorful that people just love it. And so they stop to compliment me or my husband, and he's wearing his versions of it. And then I start the conversation about plastics. And so that happens everywhere. It happens in the grocery store. It happens in the streets of New York. It happens in my neighborhood. Everywhere I seem to wear this, it builds these conversations. And because I've had all these opportunities based on this experiment, this wearable experiment, I've learned how to edit myself and not get too into the weeds and turn people off. And I try to find contextual ways to relate depending on where I am. If I'm in New York or if I'm in a grocery store, there's lots of things to point to that are wrong in the grocery store, right, with plastics. And so that's how it started. And then my most recent project, just real quickly, is I had sort of a private collection of plastic horses because I used to have a horse and train horses, and I really love horses. So when I'm collecting these plastics and buying them so they don't end up in a landfill from these last-ditch Goodwill outlets where they just dump them into bins for about an hour, they have all these huge bins in a warehouse. They dump just whatever they have from the trucks into it. Most of it has been in retail stores that doesn't sell, their retail stores. And those buckets of plastics and everything else are left there for about an hour for people to weed through. And people are like piranhas at those places. You buy it by a pound, but they're looking for all the stuff they can resell mostly. It's really a sub-industry it's become, and a subculture that's very interesting to actually witness, because this is saying that there's a lot of people that can't make a living, right, in our country, right? And then so they're resorting to this. It's certainly not as bleak as when these materials end up in a landfill in another country and families are living with their kids on plastics and electronics and picking through them and recycling them. It's a much higher level than that, but it's still a subculture. So I don't even attempt to sift through things when they first put them out, because it literally gets fights break out over things. It's strange. And the other half of it is that you see a lot of humanity there too, that there's the opposite of that, where just people are super nice. But I go through the broken stuff with rubber gloves to protect my hands from all the broken and sharp things, and I pick out the plastic toys that I can use for this work. So with that, I started to pull out all of the plastic horses because those appeal to me to use in my work. But then I decided, well, if this one framework was so successful with plastics from the beach on a very surface design that was very appealing to people that I didn't expect, I'm going to pull it out and make it a plastic horse rescue. So I've started an official plastic horse rescue, and I launched it at Open Studios last year, and I had all the horses arranged, and there were so many Instagrams from it. I also had some up for adoption, along with, I had another section that was they could adopt just plastic toys, and I explained to the kids, that, they could pick anything they wanted for $1, and that money would go back in for me to buy more plastics. So it wasn't about the money, but it was about the value, and also equating a very low dollar amount to something that, for me, that says, wow, these things were really expensive at one point. Like, I had a couple of these electron battery-operated dolls. They look kind of like me, actually, with pink hair and glasses, and they react. They have electronics in them that make them move and play guitar and all this stuff. And those things are over $120 when they're new, and people had to have them, right, when they were new, and they're just thrown as if they were nothing, right? One day they're the most valuable thing in the world, and a lot of parents, that's too much money for a lot of families to spend, right? So it becomes a status thing, which then I think hurts all of us too. And, the next day, practically, the next year at least, that object is just thrown in a landfill. Because I find them all the time. I find that's a good example. Plus, things like that, toys like that are worse because the batteries are left in them, and those just leach as well. So the Plastic Horse Rescue is my latest approachable and fun way of getting some of these things back into the life cycle, having an extended life cycle and use, but also educating people in a way that they can take in easily.
And it works, and it's just awesome. I mean, the stories you've told about that and how people have reacted, both adults and children, are very, very impressive.
Yeah, the parents or any adult, you don't have to have children to enjoy it. I think people just smile, and that's the great thing about toys. It's also the really bad thing about toys is that we relate to these characters or creatures, whatever this plastic, which is it's either oil, like my shirt, plastic's oil, or it's, fracking waste. It's ethane turned into ethylene, at cracker factories. And it's very toxic, but it looks cute. And one other thing about my forays at the Goodwill outlet is that I always find plastics from 50, 60 years ago right next to like a cheap dollar store Barbie knockoff. Like it's all mixed together because it takes hundreds, if not thousands or more years for any of that to degrade. So it never goes away. It keeps surfacing. Sometimes I think it is from, I think there's a number, pretty good number of people that try and resell things. They have little antique stores or, vintage markets. So you can tell when one of those has been closed, and then a lot of that stuff gets dumped, but then it's just mixed in with everything else.
Yeah.
All toxic. Toxic when especially left in a landfill and heat, and definitely toxic when incinerated, which is really what, a lot of this stuff recycled, depending on where you are and where the municipality is, recycled can mean incinerated.
Yeah. Great.
There's so much to unpack here. I'm sort of fascinated with this whole idea of reuse and taking things that someone thought had no value and giving it value. You talk about status, and I think this is a big piece of all this, that, there's still a stigma to going to the thrift store. We can call it a vintage store, and maybe that gets a little more higher class, but there's still a stigma toward people that shop at the secondhand stores. How do you think we can change that? I mean, you've already done a great job with your art, but is there other ways you can change to make it?
Well, it actually has changed in a big way. There's parts of it haven't changed, which is the place I described. It'd be like maybe 5% the population you would see in a regular retail establishment. Like students that look like maybe art or creative students, that type of population. But, vintage apparel is totally turned around. I mean, everybody wants to thrift for vintage apparel now, and there's many, many stores that embrace it. There's many online platforms for it. I mean, vintage apparel is sought after, and so is thrifting for vintage apparel. I think it's the other stuff, the housewares and everything else that is lagging behind, because those stores aren't everywhere, and they usually are run down. The stores that take everything, they don't have the same vibe, and they're not in Manhattan, for instance. Like, I think there's still a Goodwill. Some of them have closed. Like the City Opera thrift store used to be one of my favorites, on 23rd across from FCA. But in that row was also a Goodwill, and it was a very nice Goodwill. And then there was a Salvation Army that's pretty, like, dire. When you go in there, it doesn't feel clean. It just feels very dated. And that's the one that would have the housewares. But again, you're not getting the same population going into that store. But across the street at Housing Works, which is a very beautiful store, and all their proceeds go to AIDS, which there's a bunch of those in New York. But I'm talking about the one on 23rd Street. That's a different vibe too, and they do have housewares. That's a more upscale one, but they get a lot more love. They get a lot more support, and they have a design aesthetic. So I think it's about turning some of those things around. But as far as vintage clothes, it's very competitive now. So I find it less enjoyable, because it was very relaxing for me over the decades. Just to, that's what I would do for like fun and just to de-stress. I'll just go to the thrift store and save some stuff. And I even did, this was maybe 20 years ago now, I did a coat program, a giveaway, winter coat program for artists, because I was in this big community of artists, and I was in quite a large show where I knew a lot of these folks didn't make a lot of money, but I had rescued dozens of beautiful vintage coats, because the Goodwills used to, where I was near Wesleyan University in Middletown, lived there for a long time, they had every Sunday, whatever hadn't sold of a certain color from 4 weeks ago was $1. And I would get these fabulous coats. And also reuse of fur, which that's such a shame. I mean, when furs aren't cared for, I don't condone wear fur or anything like that. But I used to wear vintage fur as a tribute to animals who had died for it, and I used to make art with that. That was quite a while ago. You find fur coats that are like these amazing coats that animals gave their lives for, and I would rescue those. They wouldn't be in great shape, because when you don't care for them, again, it's a status thing. You have to be able to also afford to keep those in cold storage when you're not wearing them, or else they just fall apart. So that's why I found so many of that type of thing. But again, I just created a program, because I was part of this big open studios, the citywide open studios in New Haven, and I knew I could give away a lot of beautiful coats to people who needed them. And at that time, I mean, I do donate to a lot of different programs, but I gave away those coats to artists.
And you have your own repurposed or reject, right? Can you tell us about that?
Yes. Reject isn't too active right now. We do some pop-ups, but during the pandemic, Reject is based on, I first made a clothing line called Reject because I never fit in, and I'm mostly rejected from anything I formally try to enroll in, whether it's trying to get a job by submitting a resume or really anything that's just a straight path that most people would choose or think that you would have to do to get something in life, right? So I just embraced that and turned it into something that I became proud of, because anyway, Reject, it seemed to embody really everything about my life at that time during the pandemic too. There was like, you know, my husband and I both have small businesses and we didn't have a lot going on during that time. So I decided to turn Reject beyond the clothing line. I turned it into a store concept. So we had Reject Found and Made, which we turned our co-working space in South Norwalk, Connecticut into, because we couldn't have co-workers in an open space. And it did really well. A lot of people just loved a lot of people said it was their favorite store that they had been to in Connecticut, because we just had not only, you know, all the clothing that I had curated and I had collected, but we had all kinds of art books. You know, we collect art and design books, and we also have a program that we give away books called Book Drive that we developed maybe 15 years ago. So we collect books from agencies and design firms, like really nice textbooks and other industry books, and then we donate them to emerging talent at schools during professional workshops that we run for them. So that's another thing where we recycle books, because otherwise a lot of these design studios would just throw them away. So Reject did really well, and then we closed that co-working space eventually, and we opened it as a market, as part of a market that's in Bridgeport, which is a 75,000 square foot. It's a huge antiques market with about 100 vendors in Bridgeport, and we had a booth there. So we just did it on Sundays and continued to actually move a lot of stuff from the unwanted pile into the happy home pile. However, we decided to cease doing that because most of our best customers were really, like, for me with the clothes, it was Brooklynites, and, just didn't have enough of them heading our way. So I think, again, like many things trickle down from large metropolitan areas before they catch on. So I have hope for the smaller cities and suburbs in terms of the popularity of reuse. Although I think some of the really smaller places, rural areas, they're reused by nature, right? They're like, that is like the ethos of some of those things, which is wonderful. It's not about, like, what new thing can I get? What better new thing, right? Like a lot of the city mentality, newest, fastest, best, shiniest.
Yeah. And speaking of that, talking about New York and talking about LA, where you've been both places, sustainable fashion, non-sustainable fashion, fast fashion, now it's starting to be mass marketed on the web. Are we doing better? Are we doing worse? Do you see hope?
Worse.
Talk about that. What have you seen lately? Because you're out there all the time.
I think we're doing much worse. And actually, I use the word fashion, but I'm really not very interested in the fashion industry. I'm interested in apparel as an art form and self-expression, more of style as an art form, really. So fashion never really interests me, and I especially don't like the status aspect of it. What I loved about thrift store shopping forever is that it leveled that playing field for anybody, where you can't do that so much with housing or cars. It's much harder. You can do it with clothes, because anyone can go into a thrift store and for a very low amount of money look as good as anyone else, right? And so that was what drew me to it a long time ago. And I actually had a television show concept, but it was it was long before smartphones, and it was before it would be easy enough for me to do that myself. So I never actually did it, but it was to take, like, anybody off the street, bring them into a thrift store, and under 20 minutes, make them look like $1 million, because I am a style person, right? I have an eye for that. I always have. I'm not trying to brag about that or anything, but I think you just have an eye. People just tell you, right? You learn that you have an eye over time when people keep asking you to help them with something or telling you that you're good at it, even though you don't realize it. So I wanted to help people that way, because people change when they feel good about themselves, right? They have confidence, and a lot of times that's about clothes, what they're wearing. But I digress. So I do know about like Shein and the other huge fast fashion one. No, it's terrible, and I hope that there's some legislation to stop it. And it also says to me that sadly, whoever is following that, and I think it is a lot of young women, and I hate to even label ages, generations, or gender, any of that. I'd rather just be generally speaking about all people, and because I think we have enough divisions. I think they do get sucked into thinking they don't matter unless they can look a certain way. And when these influencers are given, $1,000 worth of clothes, and that means like 800 pieces of the cheapest clothes by Shein or something, and they're showing it every day on TikTok, it just makes every young person try to aspire like that. It's like those cups by, was it Stanley that made those metal? They're actually metal cups. I think they have plastic components, and then they were selling out and causing fights in Walmart. It's not sustainable when there's too much, right? When we just keep making millions of something. We don't need millions. We just need enough. So more is definitely not better.
Yeah,
I think that's a huge problem. It depends on the market too, though. It depends if they can legislate, and I don't know about that, but I love this new, the new textile or the fashion passport that is being enacted. I think it's 2025 in France, right, where you will not be able to sell anything there as an apparel unless it has that passport that says the origin of the materials and what the material makeup is for recycling. So controls like that are really going to change things, but it takes so long for it to happen.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how much time we've really got. I think your point, though, it just fascinated me what you just said about the fact that these marketers, they're literally just pouring it into the marketplace. I know I get pop-ups all the time, and I've never looked at their sites. So they are just pouring it into Google, and various other advertisers. The thing that I wonder about, it seems that Gen Z and the next generation after that, and even perhaps some millennials, are starting to think a lot about the origin of these materials, who's having to work to create them, what kinds of conditions they're in. And really, from a very straight business perspective, it's almost like when they had to start labeling cigarettes. If you have to start labeling clothing and say, you realize this came from, Bangladesh, where the average wage is blank, and, something like that, just a little notice on there. And every time they advertise it, I know it sounds government intrusion, but, hey, it's just transparency. Talk about what's really going on to create those clothes and why they're so cheap.
I also, though, think that some of that stuff can't be helped. I think it's more about how much and how we're doing things, because really, people know polyester isn't made in the U.S., right? You're not going to get polyester in the U.S. You're just not. It's not, and we're not experts at it. And to set up that kind of production, I don't think that's going to help anybody. So I just think it's more about, like, we have to have a wave of, like, it's cool to have nothing, right? As little as possible, just what we need, instead of encouraging capitalism of the type that we have. And I know, we know the conundrum. It's because every time if we're going to shut something down and it puts people out of work or out of their profession, if they have a small business, you can't just do that to all of society. And I think that's the huge problem. And with plastics, it's much more than that. People are oblivious to the damage that plastic is doing. It has been normalized, and it's the chemical companies that are creating this problem, the fossil fuel companies, because they put billions into advertising and countering it. There's even many websites that talk about plastic recycling or advanced recycling. Advanced recycling is terrible. It's chemical recycling, and it's worse. It's worse than regular recycling, which isn't a thing. I did, during the last big art fair, or the biggest art fair that I usually launch a line of apparel at, is in Miami in December. And so I've been doing a lot more collaboration with my husband because I really love his photography incorporated into the textiles. So I wanted to do something with water bottles, but not like everyone else does, with it just straight up, because he has a way of doing abstractions. And I said, well, let's go to BJ's and you can do your thing. I know if you put your camera close up to the, you're going to get some cool angles. And so we stood in the line, in the big aisle for bottled water, and I haven't bought bottled water in, I don't know, a couple decades, and I had no idea it was so cheap. It was like $3.99 for 40 bottles of water. And so I started, because it was busy, I started just interviewing people who came in the aisle and were buying water, all types of people. And I asked them why they were buying it. Because it tastes better. Our water's no good. Now, our water is good, actually. Our water's fine to drink in this, in the city. And same with New York, right? It's really good. But we're told, we get this perception. And bottled water is often just city water, right? It's municipal water. And then it's shipped, and then it's like the plastic. And they just don't have any idea. So even that little sampling for me said, that's normal life. That's the average person's opinion of it. And you can see why they don't understand why it's no good. Same with throwing it away. The beaches are just littered with stuff. Even the bottle caps being separated. I mean, we have all these bottle caps floating, and just bottles. I see people at the beach walking through it, and they don't pick it up. Even when they're here, I'm here with my little kid walking in the tide. There's a plastic bottle floating by me. just walk by it, as if it doesn't bother them or exist. And so what we see on the surface isn't really even where most of the plastic is. It's mostly at the bottom of the ocean. And 44% of our plastics now are single use. So, and that's going to continue because the fossil fuel companies are losing money on renewable energy and electric vehicles, so they're losing that market, and they plan to increase this single-use plastic.
Yeah, and 85% of them plastics in general have not been recycled, and they've only been around 75, 80 years. That people would be blown away if they actually looked at the numbers, which we do talk about in the Carbon Almanac. Is I think if people knew a little bit more, you might get a few more people to act, and I'm not sure if you blasted them with the details, they'd even listen, but maybe if a few more people, just like you do, reaching out to them, they get the message, one by one by one, and unfortunately I wish we could do it faster.
Well, it really has to be done at the legislative level. So I'm learning that. I have already taken TWAY, Beyond Plastics Grassroots Advocacy, but I'm now enrolled in the course by Judith Enck, who's the founder, and she was on Obama's administration with the EPA. She's really the most knowledgeable person I know. So she has a class at Bennington College that I started taking. It's like a 2-month course, and I'm learning even more details. And hope to get really more involved at the government level, because that's where, you got to change the laws. But I also, on the other end of that, I did get a grant that I'm going to execute. I'm going to wait till the horseshoe crabs start spawning, which is starting next month, and so I can educate about those and how important they are, how to treat them, at my local beach. At the same time as I educate kids on the plastics, and I'm going to do a project where we collect plastics and make statements together that they can actually stencil, it's like a light version. I have this other way I developed last year of working so I can work easily and quickly with other people, and it's using discarded plywood, local, that just is from shipping companies. They make cartons and they throw away a lot of plywood, and then with plastic and stenciling onto plywood, and I paint them white, but it's used house paint too. I get house paint that my friends are going to throw away, and I use that. So that's my grant, and then I'm working with the sustainability manager of Bridgeport. It's one person is responsible for that whole subject matter here, and he's finding me. We're either going to do an empty storefront or the big library downtown to exhibit the work afterwards, along with some of my other work, with the work I'm going to do with kids with this grant. So I'm trying to do what I can, but also, there's almost so much one person can do, and I'm trying to build a way that I can do it full time all the time. But at the moment, I do a lot of other things, including, I do a lot of work in cybersecurity. I also enjoy protecting people. I really like that niche. To me, it's like the healthcare of technology, where you're protecting everything else but somebody's health.
Yeah, I mean, that broad background we described is pretty phenomenal, and I mean, it really is. And it kind of, you talked about using different parts of your brain. I love the fact that the way you just described how you're trying to figure out how to make a bigger impact and a more deep impact was being innovative, adaptive, and responsive. Those are keystones to being a regenerative business. You have to be willing to adapt to what happens, and because you're regenerative, you can do it much more quickly because you're designed that way. And I'm gonna pass it back to Katherine in a second, but I want to point out that your project to protect the horseshoe crabs, as many times as people have unfortunately driven over them, you did a wonderful job, and you were pictured with Governor Ned Lamont here in Connecticut. I happen to live in Connecticut too. Yeah, it was amazing. Picture of the Carbon Almanac, everything, or a copy of the Carbon Almanac.
Yeah,
and that was very cool, but I know that's really important to you. And Katherine, I want to hand it over to you for some questions from you.
I'm really fascinated with the vast number of people that you've been able to connect with, and all these projects seem to be very collaborative. Are you noticing any commonalities between the people who are drawn to your work or the people who come to your stores, and any trends that give you hope?
Well, I am the trend myself. I don't actually. I should say I don't follow trends because they're transient, right? So I work on myself. I used to be quite stressed out about all manner of things in life, personal and world problems, and I've started just to work on myself. So that's what I do, and I also decided, well, I've tried so many ways, and even last year when I had more free time, I approached so many organizations, both for applying for paid work that they were positions they were trying to fill, and then just approaching and saying, "Hey, I'm an artist and I work in plastics and activism, and advocacy. Can I be part of? Can I do something for your org?" And it's surprising how many people do not recognize or run with that, right? And I'm sure there's very many reasons for it, but I don't think that works. At least it doesn't work for me. So instead, I am a super hopeful person, and I keep working on becoming a more positive person, which I find is iterative and exponential. And I also find it really spreads. Like the first place I noticed it was inside my own house with the people. My son lives in this home, and my husband, like it rubs off, and then they start spreading it. So it really was proven to me just on that very individual and personal basis. And the other thing is I just start these projects. Nobody, for the most part, nobody takes me up on when I approach them before something's done. I just do it. And that's really always what's worked for me in life. Okay, no one wants to hire me for this. I'm just going to do it. And then when people see the work, that's usually the way it happens. But I can't say I see a trend in it at all. It does seem pretty interesting to me always the way life has its twists and turns and opens itself up. And I think it's because I'm not a linear thinker at all, that I do kind of let my life unfold, including my career. I think that's why it's been so diverse. And many things I'm in are cutting edge, and so the cutting edge positions often just end. They're just the technology either changes completely, or it's too early, or it becomes a little dull, and the next thing opens up itself to me, and I move toward it. I wish I knew. I think it's really important to capture, that's the magic of the Carbon Almanac network, right? Is that Seth knows how to draw people towards something, and I think that's a tremendous gift. It's and that's marketing, really.
It is, and you do. I know you have a broad background in marketing too, and you've talked about the fact that, as I said in the intro, it's just amazing how many things you've done and been able to use those different parts of your brain and that background, and you've adapted to the various situations, and it's kind of cool. It's like you can say, I'm going to use this skill for this, I'm going to use this skill for this, and you apply it to what's in front of you. Those connections you've made obviously have been really, really valuable. One of our team members wanted to know if you could share thoughts about your relationship to the materials you use when you're actually creating. Maybe you can.
Oh, yeah. I'm very drawn to the materials I use. And because of the reasons I stated, because plastic is just molded into anything, right? And a lot of those shapes are nostalgic, again, because it doesn't disappear. Or just popular, or, toys a lot of times are very joyful. And, I started making bright artworks and developing even, my own character designs, including the weather squirrel. My beginnings of that started in the early 80s, and I did it to cheer myself up. I used bright colors because it made me feel, energized, and it drew me out of darker moods. And the same with developing these characters. It was to have friends. So I think that's the problem with plastic toys for sure, which is a big part of my work, is that they do all those things. They humanize, like plastic is humanized, and plastic is turned into cute animals and all these cute shapes that we're attracted to. But just as much, those materials, to me, I feel how they've been used. Like it's funny when you become so close to them and you collect so many things that you've seen, like the chewed on hands of the Barbies, right? And the marker like I'm going to draw their makeup on, or I'm going to cut their hair. And it shows you like all those human touches, those deep human connections to these plastic objects that are then just tossed. So I find that like so interesting, right? It's like you don't have to dig in the earth for these sort of understandings but it makes me feel, like an archaeologist in a way, right? You're digging through people's lives and feelings and emotions attached to these objects. And I just love reusing materials too. It just feels like, wow, like why would someone go buy something new or like have a plywood circle cut when you could just get one that is being thrown out? It just seems so incredibly wasteful. And a lot of people want the new one because it's perfect, right? They want the perfect one. And life isn't perfect, so.
Indeed, it's not. And you do such a wonderful job of the way you just described how you take something negative and turn it into a positive. How many times have we been told as children and as adults, turn that frown upside down, be happier and everything else. The reality is if you come at people in a positive way, Katherine and I were just talking about from a business perspective, if you can really make people understand why this really makes sense from a business perspective, and businesses are a big part of moving from sustainability to regenerative. Hopefully we get mostly through sustainability and, of course, all the way to regenerative business. But, if you start talking to people positively about what the opportunity is, and talk to them about nature and how important that is to everyone I know. I've said this before. Every person I know, if you say to them, when you go outside and you look up at the sky or out at that lake or out at that ocean or at that forest, how do you feel? Nobody says, I don't like it. They all say, I love it. And if we could get them to thinking about what the world really means to them, that is sort of the beginning, and we kind of have to realize that that's how we're going to want to be approached, even if we know a lot about climate issues and so forth and environmental issues and social issues. It's a heck of a lot better to say, hey, did you ever think of the opportunity if you did this, if we changed that, if we transformed that? You just got to get people talking, ask the questions that get them talking.
And it's a choice how you look at life too. And so, I have gone through quite a lot on the emotional side and, in my lifetime. And I was actually anorexic and bulimirexic and when I was in my 20s. So I had to, for my survival, find methods to overcome these things, right? And so I did. But more recently, during the pandemic, when I had time, I had already been incorporating a lot of things like a walk, energy, like movement, right? So I was doing yoga every day. I was taking a walk in nature every day. I was practicing gratitude. I don't need science all the time. I'm a science-minded person, but I also know that science is just as flawed as every one of us is, right? Science is humans trying to figure things out, but it always changes just as much as the weather. So it's a balance of what I feel intuitively with backed by, science. And so I took all this coursework and I realized, well, this really is true. And so I read a book, at least like I go through like a book a week, usually, a reference book on any of those topics like that surround well-being. And also could be climate too, but it's just all about how do we feel good as individuals and understand that anything outside is we're making that up in our belief system, right? Then there's the facts about things that we're changing, like the climate change is real, obviously, but the way we feel about it and the way that we can share a better way of seeing it and making change is within us. And so really doing that work on myself, like I had said before, that's a big part of how I do it too, by a lot of outside learning, and then from every angle so that I'm not one-dimensional in my thinking about it.
Well, you've done.
Yeah, I think if you don't have hope, you have just no place to go but down without hope, right?
Yeah, I think hope is underrated because I think hope leads to other things. Hope leads to possibilities. Hope leads to opportunities, people working together. And I think that's been a big part of what you do. And speaking of that, what's next? Kind of our last question, what's next? And do you have any particular projects in the works? I know you mentioned a couple of them that you're about to start regarding the horseshoe crab. And anything in particular you'd like to tell people about and how they can best contact you?
Well, I would say those are the main ones, and I think the only thing is that it's a local question, so local request is that I would love to build a stronger community around plastic pollution in where I am or in Connecticut, and I'm thinking of starting a chapter for Beyond Plastics here, but I just can't do it all alone, and I know this, so I would say that's the big thing on my mind. Otherwise, I'm always iterating, and as is with much of my creativity, it unfolds itself. So I'm not intellectual about how my ideas come. They just do, and then when they do, I develop them into something bigger if they seem like good ideas. So I don't have a new one to tell you. I'm developing the ones I have, which by just it's sort of the alchemy of it will unfold how that grows.
That's an awesome way of describing it, and the magic ingredients that you bring to the world and somehow put them all together to connect with people, kHyal, are really impressive. We want to thank you so much for joining us today for this Unhurried Conversation from Earthwork Collective, and just keep on doing all that great work, and we're going to keep following you. And obviously as friends, and not only with the Carbon Almanac, but with all the other things you do. You did point out something really important, though. It really starts locally, and that, again, is a real message of regenerative business, to start local, or come back to local first, and then see where it takes you. That's really impressive. Thank you so much for joining us. And
Thank you, guys. Really enjoyed speaking with you both.
Thank you, kHyal.